Now that we've allowed the user to upload images and we've determined how to do this, we need to be able to retrieve a list of images inside a specific directory. So in this tutorial, part of the tutorial, we're going to be developing the get images function, which takes in an album ID and returns a list of the images inside a specific album as an array. So let's go ahead and start to create this function. In actual fact, probably the easiest thing would be to create the file first, and that's the view album file. So view underscore album.php. Let's go ahead and start to prep this, which is the including of init.php and the including of the template files. So the header.php and the footer as well. So template /footer.php. Okay, so let's go ahead and just create a HTML header, and this is going to be the name, eventually the name of the album. So for now, we could just write view album. This will eventually take a value from the database determined by the album name that we've currently chosen. So let's go ahead and refresh our browser just so we can see the result, and we have that correctly up now. Now remember, we have this row in our database that contains the album ID and the image ID and the extension, and from this we can look inside folder 61 for a file called 9272.jpg, and that will just loop through the database depending on what album was specified and return a list of the images. So let's go ahead and start to develop our image function. So the get images function takes in an album ID, and because of this we need to be able to sanitize the data. So I'm going to create a new variable called album ID. I'm going to make this equal to casting album ID to an integer. I'm then going to create an array called images, and this will be returned by the function. We now need to go ahead and create a query. So image underscore query is equal to MySQL query. Now this is quite similar to the album, the get albums function, in which we go through the database and we return them as an array. So if you're struggling with this, go back and review the get album function in the album.func.php file, and you'll understand this a lot better. So we are selecting, we need to choose the fields we want to select, and this is image ID. We also need to select the album ID and the timestamp and the extension, and this is from images, and the condition is where the album ID is equal to, and again we've specified the album ID here, so we can just write album ID, and the user ID is equal to, and we can just append the session onto here, which is called user underscore ID. So we are taking these values from a database, from the images table, where the album ID is the album ID was specified and the user ID equals the currently logged in user. What we're now going to do is we're going to loop through the database and return this array. So we create a while loop, and the while loop will be images row. We're creating a new variable called images row, and this is equal to MySQL fetch a sock, which is fetching an associative array of this data. You may have seen this used before, and we supply the image query and able to grab them. Now in this while loop, we want to actually append or add elements to the images array, and we're going to be creating a multi-dimensional array. So this is equal to array. We can pull this down and start to insert our values. So the images array contains lots of different arrays for each image, essentially, and we need to return the following data. We first of all need to return ID. We then need to return the album, and this will be the album ID. We also need to return the timestamp. Let's just pop an arrow there. and we also need to return the extension. So let's go ahead to return the ID. We reference images row as we wrote here, so images row, and we are taking the image ID field from the table. Okay, so with the album it's exactly the same thing, but this time we want to select album ID. With the timestamp we want to select image row and timestamp. So these are all the fields from the database, this, and the image ID. And lastly we want to select the extension, so we use exactly the same and we say ext. So now what we've now done is we've created an array inside this images array for each album, and you can go ahead and use printr when you call this function to test, but we'll be looking at that a bit later on. So the last thing we want to do is actually return this images array, and obviously this means that the function will now return an array, and we can use a for each loop to loop through the data. So let's go over to viewAlbum.php. The most important thing here is that we actually need to take in the album ID. As you see when we go over to the browser, you can see that we specify an album ID in a get variable. So let's go over to our text editor. Inside our viewAlbum.php file, we need to do a few things. I'm just going to get rid of this here and echo this out, and the reason for this is we're going to be taking the code from another one of our functions, which is the album data function, and we're going to be applying this here to actually echo out the album name. So for now we can remove the break into HTML. So the first thing we want to do is take the album ID from the get variable. So $_get, equals $_get, and we're getting album ID. So this value here corresponds to the value that we specify up here in the header. And to test this, we can simply go ahead and echo this out. When we refresh, you see we get 61. Now with 61, we know this is an album ID, and we can pass this to the getImages function. So let's go ahead and just get rid of that echo there. We don't need that anymore. Now, images equals getImages, and we specify the album ID for this. So we've just created this getImages function, and we're feeding in the album ID here. What will then happen is the album ID will be read by this, will query the database, and will return all the images as each separate arrays inside images array. So nothing we haven't seen before, but it can be quite confusing when you look at this. But just pause and take a few minutes to reflect and understand how this getImages function works if you don't already. So now what we want to do is actually check if there are any images present in the current album. So we need to create an if statement, and we're going to say if empty images, meaning has the array that's been returned by this getImages function empty. If it is, we can echo out there are no images in this album. Otherwise, we want to loop through this and actually echo out all of the results. So for now, we're going to use printr, as I mentioned earlier, and we're going to print our images, and that's going to return us or give us the array of the images that are inside or have been returned by this function.